Postmodernism. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Fundamentalists podcast. I don't know about you, but I sure am enjoying these weekly uploads. Look at us being all consistent. Pete, isn't that great?
I'm loving it, man. We're back. We're going to be like big as Joe Rogan and Lex Fridman soon.
Yeah, because it's the same sexy topics like today's episode, which is specifically on postmodernism. Now, here's a little fun fact. I like to use words that make me feel and sound smarter. And postmodernism is definitely one of those. And I enjoy throwing it about haphazardly with very little regard for how accurately I'm using it. And that is kind of consistent with a lot of the things that I say and do just throughout my life. And so I thought, Pete, we could talk about what is postmodernism and when did it become so popular? And is it as popular as it used to be? If not, why? If so, why? And you are like the best person to talk about this because you studied post-structuralism, which is identical to postmodernism almost, except it is a philosophical, and and then there's and that's all I know.
Yeah. Well, and this is why you made me nervous, because you literally texted me and go like, why don't we do postmodernism, because you have done your PhD in this. And I'm like, oh crap, that means I'm supposed to really know what I'm talking about. And I wrote that PhD 30 years ago.
Yeah, a long time.
Yeah. So it'll all come back to me. It's like riding a bike. And I definitely can talk about the core elements. And actually, there's loads of stuff. Now I'm thinking about it. I'm like, there's loads of things we can say.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, can you even say it's like riding a bike? Like, does a bike even exist? Or is it just a product of, like, circumstances and where it was at the time that it was created?
That's true. And bicycle, that could be the cards. Poker, it could be something you cycle with. And there's all of these signifiers. And yes, that's good. That's good.
Yeah. It's a cycle that goes both ways.
The other thing that we might talk about is, I'm sure you know about this probably better than I do, but this interesting theory that's very popular on YouTube that Marxism became postmodernism and then became identity politics. And it kind of went from the French Academy, really actually from the German Academy into the French Academy, and then from the French Academy into America, and is kind of responsible for identity politics and identitarianism. That's interesting because that really caught a lot of attention, and that's held by people like Jordan Peterson and other people, I think, who are more in that group. That's interesting.
Yeah, I find that quite interesting because my understanding is that the idea of, say, a postmodern neo-Marxist is inherently contradictory because Marxism says that there is one underlying universal problem that is causing our things and our problems, and then postmodernism says there is no universal truth, no underlying essential grand narrative. Or am I incorrect?
Yeah, no. So there is. You're right. There's a tension there between Marxism and postmodernism that is overlooked by. And I was trying to look up. Was it James Lindsay? That's right. I remember his name, James Lindsay, because I have a secret.
Guy.
Yes, I have a secret enjoyment of James Lindsay. You have your enjoyments that we shall not speak of, and I have my enjoyments. Some of them we shall not speak of, but one of them is Lindsay. I haven't actually watched him for a while, that's why his name escaped me, but he's interesting because he actually reads the stuff. That's what's interesting to me about him, is he's actually read the people that he critiques, and so I respect that. And so I've listened to a lot of his stuff because he does say I think he gets a lot of it wrong, but as I say, he actually reads it. It's like a lot of people don't read postmodernism. A lot of people critique Derrida who have never opened a page of Derrida. But with Lindsay, whenever he critiques someone like Herbert Marcuse or Gramsci or any of these figures, he's actually read them. And he goes in for this argument. Again, it's a bit rusty, but I'm pretty sure, yes, he does. That basically Marxism became untenable in the 20th century with the atrocities of Stalin. And then Marxism basically filtered into cultural critique. So from economic critique into cultural critique with the Frankfurt School. And then this cultural critique kind of moved into this idea of just of oppression and oppressor, and this kind of Foucault thing where everything is power and domination and resistance. And then this filtered into a kind of relativism where all you have is a fight of the powerful against the powerless. And, we end up where we are here. So that's kind of like even someone like James Lindsay, or, defends this. But what I was going to say, yes, is that the truth is, you can kind of make the argument. When I listen to this argument, I can see how you could make the links. But it's like building a house and every brick is a little dodgy. And each one on its own you can be forgiven for, but eventually you build a very dodgy house. And one of the things that you brought out there is very true, is that kind of Marxism is a very particular critique. It's the idea that we live in a society that creates something called surplus value. And that surplus value is created by workers, but it's appropriated by people who are not doing that labor. And so that sacrifice is enjoyed by the owners of the means of production. This creates alienation. This creates cycles of poverty. And so that's very in a nutshell, but that's what Marx is interested in. Postmodernism, as you say, is incredulity towards meta-narratives, is the famous phrase by Guy Lyotard, which means like postmodernists don't generally like grand narratives like Marx's grand narrative about economic oppressions. So anyway, sorry. So yeah, there's definitely a tension, and I was in the middle of that when I was doing my PhD. I was in a department that was very Marxist, and then I went into a department that was very postmodern. So I was in two departments that were kind of at war with each other.
So you're one of the first postmodern neo-Marxists.
Yes. And well,
Okay.
you know,
And
and you know
that's-
where. Yeah, you know where, like, some of the truth of someone like Lindsay and Peterson is that all the postmodernists were reading Marx, but that's because every academic in Europe, Marx, you read Marx, like it's just kind of one of the great thinkers,
Yeah.
whether you agree or disagree. So there is a sense in which, yes, Derrida even wrote a book on Marx, Spectres of Marx, I think it was called, and so they were all engaging with it, and they were all Marxists of a type. So there was a connection, but also a lot of internal fighting.
Boy, I tell you, I did zone out there for just a
Sorry,
second.
I know.
And I do. But I will say that you did such a good job, Pete. You said it was going to be like riding a bike, and look at you. That was incredible. You're coming up with book titles and off the top of your head. So in terms of the history of it, I mean, this would have been what, the 80s that you were doing this? That you were doing your work?
90s. I think from the 90s and 2000s, actually early 2000s, late 90s, I think. Yeah.
And so my understanding, what I'm curious about is my understanding is that it peaked in the 80s, 70s and 80s, was sort of postmodernism's heyday. And it still exists in the imagination of people today, maybe perhaps bigger than it actually does in academia. But during that time, 70s, 80s, and I imagine still in the 90s a good bit, it was like all the rage. And so now it seems like the critiques of postmodernism have sort of battered it down. It's not really, it's like used still, but it's not this itself a grand narrative like everybody was like obsessing over it for a while, being like everything can be explained through this or not explained. I don't know, it's all very I'm curious about why it's, and also what your view is on it. Like, do you think that postmodernism are you a postmodernist still? And if you were to like if you were new to it and you were to read it and be like, okay, I'm a postmodernist, yes, that makes sense. Like, what is your kind of feeling toward it?
Yeah, and on that, like, so a lot of the critiques of postmodernism, because it's very popular at the moment to critique it, is often it's used as another way of saying relativism, and that I would definitely critique that notion. So I wouldn't call myself a postmodernist now. I kind of probably was a postmodernist or post-structuralist when I was doing my PhD. And then I kind of moved away from it. But I have a lot of affinities with it. So if I was to try to define postmodernism in a nutshell, which might be a good place to start, postmodernism, like a lot of continental philosophy, is interested in what cannot be said, what remains unsaid when we speak, what the word could be what insists, not what exists, but what insists, what this dimension that, religion has always been interested in. Religion has always been interested in what is not reducible to the material, right? So postmodernism is interested in that. And one of the key ideas what Derrida talks about is that language is always open to the future. Whenever you use a word like hospitality or justice or love, these words, we understand them and we can kind of articulate what we mean by them. But there's something about those words that is still to come. Like the Messiah, there's a messianic dimension. And what that means is your notion of justice, if you think you know what justice is, you are going to become unjust, right? So every time someone says, I know what freedom is, I know what justice is, I know what liberty is, and they call it totalizing in philosophy. They totalize it. They say, I've got it. I know exactly what it is. There is a way in which justice becomes unjust, freedom becomes unfreedom, liberty becomes slavery. And Derrida wrote very beautifully about how some of the language that we have is eternally open to reinterpretation and re-understanding, and we can never close it off. It's like that Buddhist thing. If you see the Buddha on the road, kill him. It's like if you get justice, kill it, right? Because justice is always to come. Justice is always still to arrive. Yeah.
How does that apply to? Are you saying that applies to specific words or all words?
You could say that it applies to language in general. Yeah.
Like the dumbest question. Do you mean all the words? Language.
Except for two.
About,
there's two words that don't.
Yeah.
Balloon and
hippopotamus. Banana. Yeah. You're going to get as far as you're going to get. So how is hospitality always coming? How is that? Is there always a new thing to learn about how to be hospitable to your neighbor? There's always in life, is this sort of like a nice, not morality play, but a kind of like, well, there's always something right around the corner that's going to change. Is it kind of like that? Like it's less about, I don't get it.
Okay. Well, imagine almost like, say in the world today, let's imagine there's like 100 different ways in which cultures show hospitality. So in some cultures, it might be, you feed the person. For some, it might be that you bring them out for a drink or whatever. But all these cultural different ways of showing hospitality. All of those, when you bring them together, they don't totalize hospitality. It's not that if we get all of the different ways throughout all of history that people have understood the word, we'll have a full notion of that definition. There's a sense in which all of them share something. They have, it's like a language game in Wittgenstein, maybe call it. There's something they share in common, but they don't exhaust. Hospitality, there's always new ways in which it could be shown, which could manifest itself. So that's the promise. That's the messianic dimension of hospitality. Is never think that the way you do hospitality is the way. And in fact, if you think it's the way, you might end up doing violence. You might end up in your desire for showing hospitality. If you're not open to the promise, if you're not open to rethinking it, reimagining it, reinterpreting it, it may become its opposite.
Yeah. It's like when I grew up eating venison, and my folks, which is code for deer, It's, just in case a lot of people don't know that.
Bambi.
Time for me to give you some knowledge, Pete. And venison means deer, and sometimes my current wife is not a fan of. She did not grow up eating venison, as I did. But it's a very lovely hospitality thing to make dinner for people, and so it's yeah. My parents' version of hospitality includes, of course, have this delicious venison. I say, oh, what a lovely thing of venison. But maybe other people are like, that's deer. I don't want to eat deer. And then I go, no, you're gonna eat it because that's what they're being nice by giving you that venison. And then there's a force feeding thing that happens, and then there's a lot of like throwing up, but and purging. But besides that, I think I get what you're saying. Is that correct? Do I understand postmodernism now?
That's perfect. And well, actually, overeating is a very Irish way of showing hospitality. We force food on people and ask multiple times. And I'm sure there are cultures that are the opposite, where you show hospitality or you show respect by eating very little or something. I mean, that's the thing. It's all will manifest itself in all sorts of ways, and that's kind of a symbol of language, of all language. Language, we never are able to articulate ourselves completely. That's why you want to write another book. If you're a writer, you want to do another podcast because you're like, we didn't really say it all there. There's this openness to discourse, openness to language, and for Derrida politically, and this is a really interesting political position, is that we should all kind of have fidelity to the justice to come, to the hospitality that we do not yet know, to the freedom that we don't know. And here's key, and this actually is a good callback to our Chomsky-Foucault episode, because in that episode we talked about how Chomsky kind of feels like he knows what justice is and what it looks like, and Foucault kept saying, all we can talk about is kind of what's unjust now and a promise of justice, but as soon as you kind of name it, you potentially are going to get into trouble. And so Foucault there, as a very important post-structuralist, is you're seeing this idea of a fidelity to freedom and to justice and to beauty and to hospitality, and at the same time a humility about how you concretize those terms.
Did you hear that real loud beep just a second ago?
I didn't know.
Oh, weird. Wonder what that was. Anyway, okay. So this reminded me of a book I read called The Alchemy of Discourse by Paul Kugler, and he's a Jungian guy, but he did this whole. Really, it's not about the book. I need to read it again. I really did like it, but the cover shows one of those diagrams like you're talking about, where you have the word and then it branches off into another word, which branches off into another word, and it's all of these sort of associations that get clustered around a particular word, but there is no. Like, it's like, how you say before, or have said before, that the the dictionary is made up of definitions, but each definition is made up of another word, so it's like circular. Did we screw up when we made the dictionary? Should we just never had dictionaries before?
Yeah,
I heard something in that case before.
I mean, you
Anyway,
almost want a dictionary with you almost are looking for a word that's not connected to other words, but that's very postmodern. What you're saying is that words just connect to other words. There's nothing in the dictionary that connects to reality. Whenever you get to rock, there's not a rock. It's just another set of words. So that web of language, postmodernists take very seriously, try to understand what that means.
And from a Lacanian perspective, this, I would imagine, would fit in because it's about language and it's about that lack that occurs between the actual rock and the definition of the rock. Is that correct?
Yeah, and so there's a slight difference, and I'm more Lacanian than Derridean. So the slight difference is that because both are interested in this idea of lack. Oh, and I'll give you one very beautiful Derridean example of this. First of all, is Derrida says that. Whenever you're trying to be just, you write laws. A society creates laws, and those laws, at their best, are attempting to express what justice is. But laws never express what justice is completely. That's why we're always having to develop the law, and it changes over time. It doesn't change like willy-nilly. It's sediments. But then new cases come along and sometimes laws are changed. And then Derrida says, so the laws that we make, the concrete material laws that we make, are never just. They never reach justice. But we would never even be able to conceptualize justice without the laws. The laws are the only way in which we touch justice. So weirdly, while the law always fails to be just, it is precisely through our fidelity to the law that we have a sense of justice. And he calls that the undeconstructible. So Derrida is known for what's called deconstruction, and people critique him for that, but later in his work he said, but there is something that's undeconstructible, and it is the promise of that's in hospitality, the promise that is within justice. And it's a very beautiful image, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's you can't get rid of the fantasy that it is you are on your way toward it in some sense, I guess.
Yeah.
Man, I am just my words are not coming out today the way that they should. Gosh, I apologize. It's just like pure frenetic energy. But anywho, when people hear the term postmodernism, Pete, and they and you're, as you were saying, it's all relative. Like they use it in place of the word relativism. It's sort of relativism. Like here's a fancier way of just saying like you don't really believe in anything because anything is all, that clip from Wolf of Wall Street with Matthew McConaughey when he's going, it's a flimsy, it's a floozy, it's a fairy dust. It doesn't exist. It's one of my favorite lines of all time. Yeah. But that kind of, I think, is like the postmodernism also in a nutshell of just like, everything is all made up. And so therefore, if you believe in this stuff, you don't have any leg to stand on in any kind of argument or in any kind of decision-making capacity because you don't have it. And then you have this sort of like much more, then it goes into the conservative liberal thing. And then the postmodernists are the relativists who tend to be on the liberal side. And then the conservatives are the more, I guess would be essentialist or something. Would that be? They're definitely not postmodern. Yeah. What would be the alternative to?
Essentialist
I guess
is
the alternative
good.
to postmodernism would be any. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. No, essentialism is a good term for it. Like, and also, because there's some people who say like scientific realism, like when we speak about reality, words hit reality. And which is, it's a very, like, words are fascinating, like, because what is the relationship between what we say and what is out there? And that's a big and interesting topic, and I think we can answer it, but it's definitely not an easy one. But some people on one side say, well, when I talk about a rock, I'm talking about, and I can point at something, I can point at reality, so my words give me access to reality. And then some people say, no, your words actually separate you from reality. Your words are a type of a wall that blocks something. And then sometimes you see postmodernism as that. Yeah.
Which camp do you fall into?
Well, obviously, I wouldn't go into either of those camps, kind of, because those are your two kind of basic camps. Well, but what I would, there's Simone Weil had a beautiful analogy for language, which was imagine two prisoners in cells side by side, and there's a wall down the middle, and they tap on the wall to communicate. The wall is both what separates them and also what allows them to communicate. And, that's what language is for Weil. It's a wall that separates and joins. And one has to figure out how to, what that means in a technical sense. But there's a sense in which it divides and it also connects. But I would say, what would I say? I suppose I would say this, and this is why I'm not a postmodernist as such, is I think that the thing that you cannot communicate, the dimension.
You're doing a great job.
Yes.
This is
yes,
great.
Thank you. Yes, yes. The dimension within language that cannot be spoken is actually part of reality. That's actually our inability to understand ultimate reality is because ultimate reality doesn't understand itself. So there's something about language that is actually reflective of the very nature of reality. So it's not that we are separate from reality speaking about it. We are reality speaking about itself. And then that brings you into an interesting way of trying to understand how reality fits with language. When you say that there's something about the nature of reality that's structured like a language, if that makes sense.
Do you do you enjoy poetry?
Not a lot. I do occasionally. Funnily enough, I was looking up a poem by Pablo Neruda. Is it Neruda recently? But no, generally I don't read much poetry. Why do you?
Yeah.
What's your thoughts?
I don't. Well, I was just thinking about language and the sort of getting into the poetry and the music, and I can listen to a rap or a pop song and feel something that isn't that I'm reading into the lyrics of whatever they might be. But then I was just thinking about poetry in general and how it sort of elicits all of these emotions that are different from just linear language. And so I'm wondering if you think that that is still more like proof of what you're talking about because it shows that there's an abundance behind the language, or if you specifically are talking about our everyday communication, like if it's just prose or whatever.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I would want to say that actually poetry might show the truth of it more easily. But there's something about all language, even the most scientific language, that is eternally open. And the reason why then I think the critique of relativism is wrong here is because at that stage someone might say, well, is everything poetry? No, you can never fully grasp something. There's always this possibility of reinterpretation. But for someone like Derrida, knowledge accumulates through this constant openness to the future. And it is true that every theory and every knowledge system has within itself the ability to be critiqued and be rethought and reimagined. But it's not that none of it means anything. Derrida is very clear. It's not that law doesn't mean anything. Law is our access to justice. So Derrida is really trying to understand how is it that we can know certain things and say certain things, and yet there is really an eternal dimension to something like the scientific enterprise that just never ends. And he's trying to kind of conceptualize that. But I do understand that a lot of people and a lot of these Foucault, I was never a huge fan of Foucault and his work. Like he basically, when you read him, he will tell you the history of something like Discipline and Punish, one of his books. He articulates the history of discipline and punishment and how it was horrific. You go back far enough, people are hung, drawn, and quartered. He starts the book with this guy who tries to kill a king and is tortured to death. And then he just charts how from there we get to modern schools with bells and rows of seats, and he kind of charts it and shows everything comes out of something else, everything. But he what you basically get from Foucault is this notion that there's no truth to anything. There's just a kind of like a genealogy of which something that we think is true is just constructed. The way we do schools, that we think, oh, that's the way you should do education, actually has this crazy history. Anyway, so I think Foucault is the one who a lot of people are attacking when they say postmodernism is relativistic.
What did postmodernism itself come out of?
Oh, well, interestingly, kind of in philosophy, structuralism, that's why it's called post-structuralism in philosophy, because it came out of structuralism. And structure, and I'm more of a structuralist. Structuralists arose out of linguistic theory, Guy Saussure, and I'm getting too theoretical here. but
that's real.
Okay.
I meant like contextually, societally, culturally, what was going on. That like, because it's the 20th century. You got a couple world wars. You got like the decimation of people, and then I think of also the idea that like everything's going to work out great because they had two world wars basically back to back. And so I'm imagining that had some kind of disillusionment that led to something like postmodernism.
Yes, no, that's very true. There's a cultural milieu where, in one sense, these massive, what they call meta narratives, these grand stories of how reality works, started to become horrific. And started to kind of like, so like, Marxism becomes, like you see Stalinism, and you see fascism. You also see logical positivism. You see a form of treating human beings, psychologism, where we treat human beings like Pavlov's dog, But these grand narratives of, like, say, fascism and Marxism, whatever, there was definitely this sense in which these had all started to be horrific and problematic. And so this idea of incredulity towards meta-narratives was a way of saying, hold on a second, maybe these totalizing ways of seeing the world are the problem. Like, when you have a totalizing lens through which to see the world, this causes totalitarian conflict. So yeah, that's maybe the cultural milieu that you're talking about. Yeah.
What do you think was the cultural milieu that led to the decline of postmodernism? What made people go, like, now they're still arguing about it, and I get that, but, like, why the return to grand narratives?
Yeah, and that's really interesting, because that's kind of what's partly happening. And there is a sense in which, like, I do see why people see postmodernism as flirting with relativism. I am critical of postmodernism because of the way that it critiques grand narratives. I think we can kind of have more stronger notions of what to do in the world. But yeah, it's interesting because some people say that you've got on one side intersectionality, fourth wave feminism. That's really, really where postmodernism is still alive. And then you have people on the right who are very much, in favor of universality, of what I could call a positive universality, meaning we can know things that are like meritocracy. We can create a society that is based on rational foundations that are beneficial to all. So you kind of got that battle going on at the moment.
Where do you fall on it? What do you think?
On that?
What do you think, Pete? Yeah, tell us the truth.
Okay, I would say, right, you've got, let's go with that, and I'm going to use right and left, but I hate those terms at the moment as well. But people who maybe are sometimes associated on the right, you could say that they affirm a positive universal, which means people on the right tend to go, like, there's, something like facts don't care about your feelings, which is like, facts are universal, they're true, wherever you are, whoever you are. And we can build a society, and have a society often where actually rationality and universal principles of justice and merit kind of operate. They're not perfect. They'll say they're not perfect, but these are good things. Then you have, and I kind of identity politics critique of that, which says that beneath all of these supposed universals that are disinterested, like meritocracy, they actually benefit some people over others and some groups over others. So this is the eternal battle between those two. Is one takes great joy in showing that the other side implicitly has to believe in universals, right? In order to argue. And the other takes real pleasure in showing that beneath these supposedly disinterested ideas of justice, there's actually a privilege to some people, and there's a detriment to some other groups. I advocate for what's called negative universality. This is the third step. Negative universality is, yes, every positive universal can be deconstructed, but there is a negative universal, which is we are all lacking subjects, and that's what unifies us. So
nice. So I had a thought, and it is right here. It was about the let's use 9/11 as an example in the post 9/11 world, and a lot of the stuff going on right now. I was watching some leftist commentators, and I realized, I was like, what's going on here? I was like, because I agree with these people politically for the most part. I was like, but something is missing that I think is like not, that the left is getting in its communication pretty wrong. And I was like, I wonder if it's like that rage or that emotion that people felt after 9/11, or after they feel after some grand act of injustice, it isn't oftentimes given a voice on the left, which instead goes into this very political, like, maybe intersectionality is the wrong word, but it's like goes into all the historical context, all of the way of understanding how this happened in like a cause and effect kind of way. And I think that's all great, but then I'm like, where does that emotion go? Like, where does the feeling that you have when you see or hear about something that is unjust? It's like it gets almost ignored oftentimes by those who seek to just harp on the context. Does that make any sense? And is it related to what you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, this is, if I hear you right, which I think it's very important. Like, if Todd McGowan wrote a book, Enjoying Right and Left, and in that book he kind of argues that, you know, there is enjoyment that can be described as of the right, and enjoyment that can be described as of the left. And enjoyment of the right is what he would call scapegoat. Well, no, what he would call non-contradictory enjoyment, where you have to have a scapegoat. There's something happens and you need someone to blame, and there's real enjoyment in that in order to be able to, right? But they're bad, right? So he thinks that's reactionary enjoyment. By definition, it's always kind of reactionary enjoyment. But then he talks about emancipatory enjoyment, which is an enjoyment which comes out of seeing that somehow we're all part of something, and we have to kind of like take responsibility for that. And the problem is the left has always been really bad at galvanizing that type of emancipatory enjoyment. The right's always been better at it, because there's something more primal about scapegoating. There's a real primal thing. Now, the thing is, and I don't think, this is where I think Todd and I might be slightly different, is I think what goes under the term leftist today is right wing, in that any scapegoating enjoyment is inherently of the right. That's the kind of argument that Todd's making, is it doesn't matter what your politics are, if you can point to a group of people who, if you could just wipe them off the face of the planet, everything would be great. I'd say that's reactionary enjoyment by definition. Yeah. But we have to then give an alternative to that. What is an emancipatory enjoyment? And that's more difficult.
Thinking about that in relation to COVID and 9/11, and thinking about how 9/11 there was sort of this like faux unity that happened. I mean, obviously not for everyone, but in my experience, it was where I was growing up, and it was like, yeah, there's a scapegoat, there's a group of people we have to get rid of, but with COVID, there's no face, there's no group that you can put with it, so we just made it each other, and we went after one another, and Fauci or Trump or whatever, it was one of these guys' fault basically, and it's like we have to have a something to look at and be like, that's the issue right there.
Yes, I mean, for me, like the only way to combat that is to somehow enjoy looking at your own community or your own individuality. And this is the enjoyment of psychoanalysis, because when you're in psychoanalysis, there is something enjoyable about being on a couch and examining your own past, your own unconscious, this dimension of yourself that you don't know. If there's no enjoyment, you're not going to stay, because you have to pay a lot of money for it, and it's also very painful, and you may cry and you may be upset. So, but there is an enjoyment in uncovering your own unconscious. So in a similar way, there is some enjoyment about being able to look at how I am part of the society that I'm in, and how I am woven into these issues, and I'm not separate from them. But that's a more difficult enjoyment. It's one you have to work at.
Do you know what's even better than psychoanalysis?
What's that? Depth psychology?
A bath.
A bath. Oh, I was thinking about that the other day. I was like, I'm so embarrassed. I think that out of everything I said, you were like, so Pete, you were sitting in the bath. We self-care day. Were you just looking after yourself?
Yeah. Let's play the tape back. Let's do a replay on that. Because you've said that, I've known you, we used to live together, and you would quite frequently say, like, I'm in the bath, and I'd love that. I'm like, man, I gotta get into baths. Pete knows something that I don't know.
Oh, it's a secret, man. Do you
And
not
you
have
can,
baths?
I gotta get my bath fixed. My
Yeah.
lovely wife likes to do home improvement things and then do them halfway, and then I gotta call somebody. But anyway, yeah, I do need to do a bath again, and I do hot tubs. That's my thing. But
Oh, yes.
I love a good hot tub, and I find that whatever kind of body of water you're in, it's great for, like you're talking about, that feeling of when you're uncovering something about the unconscious, and you're going, "Oh, there's an insight into my behavior I didn't previously realize," and it's fun. I think it's so, like, we don't give enough credit to how much fun it is, even if it's in a narcissistic way. When we go to therapy and they're like, "Oh, did you think that maybe the reason you're doing it it's because of that?" You're like, "Oh, cool." It's very creative sometimes, in my opinion.
Yeah. And the
There's a
difference
book.
then. Oh, good.
Please,
Oh,
no, please
I was
ask me.
just I was just going to say, and the difference between then what happens in psychoanalysis and what happens in, say, postmodernism is, in postmodernism, the nothing is always ahead of you. So it's very Jewish in a sense of very messianic, right? You're waiting for the Messiah to arrive. The Messiah never arrives, but you cultivate this eternal openness to the incoming of what will never arrive. For psychoanalysis, the this dimension of the unknown has arrived. It's there, and it's called the unconscious. It's not something that's coming. It's in you. It's a hole. It's a black hole that is within you, and maybe that simplifies it a bit. But I think it's a good way to initially understand the difference. And I was very influenced by this idea of this openness to the never-ending future. But the more I read psychoanalysis and the unconscious, I was going, no, no, no. This unknown is not something in the future. This unknown is here, and there's a Christological dimension to that, which is the Messiah is here, and you still can't grasp him. So they wait for another Messiah. So it's the arrival, and that's what psychoanalysis is. It's going, no, you have a dimension of the unknown right in your heart.
I'd like to use the analogy of, like, the difference between 1 and infinity, and then the infinity between 1 and 2. Like there's no like the middle numbers, those decimal points. You can keep going and going and going, and still never reach the end. But then there's 2 still. It's crazy. How do numbers work, Pete? That's a different episode.
Yes.
All right, so
That's a great analogy.
I have just
That's a great analogy. But the infinites between 1 and 2, and so like almost like, say, postmodernism is like the infinite that goes on forever, and psychoanalysis is like the infinite that's within. Yeah. Yep.
fissures. Man, dude, I feel like I have just. Apologies to everyone who's listened to this. I'm all over the place on this episode, and so thank you for carrying it so well.
Well, no, I want to apologize because I thought I was a bit all over the place, and also, getting a bit. It was all coming back to me, so I was kind of throwing in things, and then structuralism and all of that, But
it's a lot of words. It's dense, but man, dude, I mean, you know your stuff. It's so fun because it's like a real life Chat GPT where I can just ask you, and it'll be like, well, it's this, and this. Very specific.
I was probably all wrong.
GPT.
Yeah, I'm as wrong as ChatGPT, more wrong than ChatGPT. And I've been trying. ChatGPT is brilliant, and then just suddenly gets things incredibly wrong. It's so weird.
Yeah. It's getting worse, I think. I've found that it's too afraid to be wrong and too afraid to. It's getting like overly timid, and it's
very timid.
Because
it agrees with me all the time, and I would say I'd ask it something, and it's trying to agree with me, and I'd go, well, are you sure that's right? Like I've had a couple of times where I've asked it something about I was asking the question about this philosopher Deleuze and where he got this phrase "body without organs." I knew it was a French guy, and I just couldn't remember his name. And he was going, "No, yeah, he just made it up." And I'm going, "I'm sure he didn't." And he goes, "Oh," and then I basically had to tease it out of ChatGPT, but it just seemed like it didn't want to offend me. Very weird.
Yeah. I've had that with like trying to find a quote or trying to find like where in something is located, what book a particular quote is, and it'll be like, oh, it's in this book, and I'll look it up. Like it'll be like in the Jung's collected works. I'm not going to read that, ever. So I'll look it up. What ChatGPT says, it'll be dead wrong. and I'm like, it's not in there, and it'll be like, oh, my mistake, it's over here instead. I'm like, all right, cool.
Yeah, it's very
Anyway.
weird. Yeah.
All right. Well, any final thoughts on postmodernism? I know this is kind of like a quick thank you, ma'am, one and done thing, but for such a big topic, I feel like I have a slightly better grasp on it, but I also feel like I've just really dropped the ball on this episode. So,
No.
but that's just mostly my frenetic, caffeinated brain, I think.
Yeah.
Not the fact that you did anything wrong, Pete.
Thank you. Well, I would love us to do, I think it would be really fun to do that narrative of the kind of Marxism to postmodernism to identity politics someday. I'd love to chart that. So that would be fun to do. But my takeaway, yes, on this little episode, I'm about to do a retreat, so I feel like my mind hasn't been fully in it, but we'll still put it up, is just that postmodernism. And you brought this out. It was kind of like partly grew out of skepticism about grand stories about reality and how these grand stories of justice can become unjust, and opening up a kind of politics that doesn't try to totalize the world, but is always open to new understandings and new possibilities. And that's a good way of thinking about postmodernism if someone doesn't want to study it. It's just this openness to the future that sees what we currently understand about justice and hospitality and love as important and as significant, but that these terms always carry within them a promise of something that still hasn't been delivered. And what someone like Derrida would say, and it's beautiful, is that almost like for him, the religious figure is the one who is eternally open to that promise and that possibility. And when we close ourselves off from that possibility and that promise, that damages us and it damages the people around us. We become rigid. And there's something about trying to always remain open to what is to come. And that's out till the day that we die. So, yeah.
Yeah, because that we know is coming. That one, the death is
Yes.
the big one, right?
Death
and then
is
we
coming.
get the answers. Okay.
Yeah.
I was thinking about in terms of just academia, the sort of grand narrative of academia is a picture of them being entirely postmodern all the time, and it just seems like a very myopic view of a institution that is supposed to be filled with all of these different perspectives, and I think that's still going on, maybe not to the degree that people would like, but it's interesting that postmodernism is like the idea of academia has a grand narrative that it is only about the postmodernists, and it seems like there's a bunch of people who are offering different perspectives these days, and I think that's cool.
Yeah. Very true. Very true. Yeah.
Well, that's what I offered. I apologize to everyone for who I am. Thank you so much for being here, Pete.
See ya. Bye.
All right, bye everybody.